A cold morning at Aleje Jerozolimsky and the Vistula bridges. By noon in Warsaw, 1944, the old rule that tanks owned streets no longer worked. The reason fit in a single throwaway tube. Corners became ambush sites and armor rules written in North Africa, and the steppe failed inside brick and tram lines. Subscribe. New evidence first, World War II videos every day. Dawn on the 4th of August, 1944. Low cloud and smoke over the Wola district, Warsaw. Tram tracks ran east toward the Vistula River and south toward the railway yards at Cherniakov. German assault groups moved behind light tanks and assault guns, counting on the old rule. Armored fronts with close infantry screens would push through small arms and grenades. That rule had held from the first year of the war through the spring in Italy and the summer in Belarus. It assumed the defender lacked a cheap weapon that could pierce heavy plate at alley distance. The surprise mechanic was a one-shot hollow charge tube the size of a short fence post. German troops called it Panzerfaust, the tank fist. It did not need a gunner's school or a tripod, and it did not care about armor slope. At tens of meters, its shaped blast bit through steel that anti-tank rifles could not touch. The kill lane shifted from 200 meters with guns to 50 meters at a corner. By the 6th of August, 1944, armored cars probing along Chodna Street found that every doorway could hide a warhead. Assault guns turned their hulls to cover, then stopped short. Infantry inched ahead, then pulled back when one tube flash could end a vehicle. The hard metric was simple and cruel. At 40 to 60 meters, the hit chance soared, and the shaped charge cut more than 150 millimeters of rolled plate. The battlefield shrank to the length of a tram stop. The old rule said only guns could stop tanks. In Paris in 1940, in Kharkiv in 1942, and near Kursk in July 1943, anti-tank success rode on heavy pieces and mine belts. Now, a disposable tube made that weight less decisive inside streets. The geometry changed. Alleys made crossfire, basements made covered approaches, and corners made firing points with 1-second exposure. Tanks had to lead blind or not lead at all. Witness objects from both sides recorded the break. A Home Army Unit AAR page dated the 7th of August, 1944, logged a German self-propelled gun halted at less than 60 meters by a single high-explosive anti-tank shot near the church on Volska. A German production tally from HASAG showed thousands of tubes consigned to Warsaw depots by the middle of August. A decoded signal summary forwarded to the German City Command on the 29th of August listed train car numbers for Faustpatronen to Schrodmesche. Paper trailed steel, and the paper showed scale. Logistics and training set the pace. Boxes arrived in rail sidings along the Vistula, were trucked to police yards, then hand-carried forward in crates of 20. A training vignette appears in a battalion note. 2 minutes to show sight marks, 5 minutes to repeat stance and backblast warning, then one live shot into a scrap hull by the river wall. The skill ceiling was low by design. The danger behind the tube was the real teacher, and the chalk diagrams warned about it in thick lines. Terrain and conditions amplified the effect. Brick walls masked approach and cut wind, soot hid movement, rubble slowed turret traverse. Street width at Aleje Jerozolimsky gave only 1 or 2 tank lengths before the next bend. Rain made clutches screech and crews button up. With every turn, the range fell inside the 50-meter comfort zone where the tube site's simple arcs made sense. Myth met evidence in the city files. The myth said the weapon misfired more often than not. Evidence on a maintenance card bundle from a police arsenal on the 21st of August showed a misfire rate logged below 3 in 10 under field dirt, with most faults traced to cracked propellant packets and damp. Range tables pasted to the flip site gave aiming arcs at 30, 60, and 100 meters. The penciled ticks on those tables, preserved in an aerial recon photo of a captured cache, matched the real distances of Warsaw blocks. Units and places fixed the pattern. SS Sturmbrigade Durlwanger pushed on Wola's grid. Kampfgruppe Rheinefahrt worked from the riverside. Armored detachments from Panzer Division Hermann Göring sent guns through the Old Town gates. Map cues were plain. Aleje Jerozolimsky at the Poniatowski Bridge, the line of the Vistula embankment, the rail spurs to the west. By the 2nd of October, 1944, after 2 months of block-to-block grind, the old rule about street armor had bled out under a cheap tube's arc. By April in Berlin, 1945, the same rule break met a different opponent. Soviet Guards tank brigades crossed the Spree at Moltkebrücke and swung into the Tiergarten. Volkssturm companies with crates of tubes filled stairwells along Unter den Linden and the Anhalter Bahnhof approaches. Again, the hard number held. A clear firing lane of less than 70 meters meant a first shot kill was likely if the warhead hit square. Another witness object appeared in a rail manifest stamped on the 12th of April, 1945. 40,000 tubes consigned to Army Group Vistula depots. A Soviet aerial recon photo from the 20th of April marked knocked-out assault guns at street corners with short blast scars on side armor, a signature of a shaped charge. A range table torn from a training leaflet lay on a curb in a newsreel frame. The arcs were the same 3 distances printed since the previous year. The quiet contradiction sat under all of this. None of it was an accident. The tube was built to be thrown away, to be learned in minutes, and to work in places where a field gun could not be hauled. The city, with its corners, was not a problem for it. It was the plan. The rule that tanks owned streets was not broken by chance. It was broken by a design that made every doorway a gun pit at human scale. The human lever stood far from the alleys. In 1943 at Leipzig, an engineer named Heinrich Langweiler and a small HASAG team took a shaped charge warhead and asked for the simplest launch they could build at speed. The Ordnance Office, WA-proof, had a need on paper by late spring. Give infantry a one-man anti-tank strike that required almost no steel and very little training. Test shots at Kummersdorf in the summer put holes in old plate at close range. The acceptance notes carried a short line that would matter in cities, effective at house front distances. The person who turned design into mass was not a gunner. In Berlin, the Heereswaffenamt signed off on series production in the second half of 1943 for the Faust Patronen, and then the Panzerfaust numbered by range. Senior officers who planned armor at corps level had little say. Depot officers and police quartermasters would carry the decision forward with truck keys and stamps. The order path moved through paper stacks, not parades. One decision point came with a pen stroke in the autumn of 1944. The decree that raised the Volkssturm on the 18th of October directed that these tubes be the core arm of city defense. GAU offices and city commands were told to draw from railheads and issue to blocks, factories, and schools. Boxes went straight from cars to courtyards. The intent was not to teach complicated gunnery. It was to place a shaped charge at every corner. The Warsaw fight forced an earlier local push. SS Gruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zalewski, charged with crushing the uprising, demanded more short-range anti-tank weapons after the first week exposed the limits of guns in alleys. His staff called depots along the Vistula and cleared trains through Radom. A decoded signal summary from the 20th of August listed car numbers, consignments, and drivers. The priority was set by name and delivered by rail. An obstacle sat in the way: training time. Infantry schools could not absorb thousands of men for weeks while the Eastern Front moved toward the Vistula and the Allies crossed the Seine. The workaround was pictorial. A training leaflet with stick figures and 3 sight arcs fit inside the crate lid. A logistics note from a city arsenal on the 24th of August recorded an average of 15 minutes from first lesson to first live shot behind a river wall. Another obstacle was supply of explosives in liners. Copper was tight, steel was thin. The answer cut the weapon to essentials. The tube was mild steel. The fins were simple. The liner stayed copper because it had to, but the rest became whatever the plant could stamp. A production tally for November 1944 showed output climbing by tens of thousands as jigs and presses simplified. The final hard choice was distribution. Frontline divisions with their own guns argued for priority. City commands said their alleys were where the tube mattered most. The decision point fell toward the cities. A rail manifest for Berlin on the 12th of April, 1945, showed consignments to Volkssturm battalions by district: Mitte, Friedrichshain, Kreuzberg. The Ostbahnhof, the Anhalter Bahnhof, and the Lehrter Bahnhof all saw pallets rolled to trucks within hours. Units turned orders into pattern. In Warsaw, SS Sturmbrigade Durlwanger and Kampfgruppe Rheinefahrt took crates forward while Panzer Division elements covered crossings near the Poniatowski Bridge. In Berlin, Panzer Division Müncheberg placed mixed groups of tankmen and Volkssturm with tubes along the Spree and the Landwehr Canal. Soviet formations on the other side of the map pins, 3rd Shock Army, 9th Guards Tank Corps, and 79th Rifle Corps, met the result at street range. The human lever at the top made the corner fights possible at the bottom. A short training vignette captured the change. A block leader in Berlin Mitte gathered 10 men in a stairwell on the 19th of April, 1945. A depot sergeant walked through stance, sight arcs at 30, 60, 100 meters, and the rule about backblast. One live shot was fired into a hull plate leaned against a cellar wall near the Spree. The rest were handed out with a note to fire only from doorways or open windows. Terrain and weather shaped the rollout. Snow flurries on the 21st of April cut visibility to a few house fronts on Unter den Linden, which helped the tubes and hurt long-barrel guns. Rubble piles on Frankfurter Allee made natural firing rests at chest height. Rain on the 23rd of April pooled oil on cobbles near Anhalter Bahnhof, forcing tanks to slow under the very windows where tubes waited. Conditions kept compressing range until the sight arcs on the flip plate matched the street. Myth met evidence at the decision point, too. The myth said the weapon was a desperate last resort that appeared by chance at the end. Evidence shows a paper trail from mid-1943 design meetings to Kummersdorf tests to mass production before Warsaw and finally to the Volkssturm decree. A witness object, a Heers Waffenamt circular from September 1943, spelled out unit allotments by depot. The corner ambush did not appear from panic. It came from plan and plant. By the 29th of April, 1945, the decision's reach was visible in the Tiergarten. Soviet tank battalions advanced in short bounds between intersecting streets along the Spree. Each bound fell within the 100-meter sight arc of a nearby window. The human lever had set off a chain: design, decree, depot, doorway. The city became the weapons range card, and the dates on the orders matched the days the old rule died. The system was simple because it had to be. A thin steel tube held a propelling charge at the rear and a long standoff stick at the front. The warhead was a hollow charge cone with a copper liner sized like a small bucket. A flip-up sight on the side carried 3 arcs, 30, 60, and 100 meters. The operator shouldered the tube, aligned the arc with the target at alley distance, and pressed a simple trigger. On firing, a charge drove the warhead clear and ignited the sustainer, sending the head outward at modest speed. The blast at the rear created a backblast cone that could burn and overpressure anyone directly behind for several meters. That hazard-shaped method: shoot from a doorway, a window with the room cleared, or from open stairs. The shaped charge did the real work. When it hit, a focused jet punched through armor as if it were a drill of metal fire. Armor slope and thickness lost their value within the weapon's limits. Limits were part of the method and showed in the numbers. Effective range for the early model was about 30 meters. The mid-war model extended to roughly 60 meters. The late model pushed near 100 meters. Penetration figures sat above 200 millimeters on square hits. Reliability in field dirt was logged around 70% on maintenance cards reviewed in city depots. Misfires traced to damp cartridges and bent sticks. Witness objects pinned these details. Range tables glued to the sight plates, many still greasy from hands, gave the arcs and printed warnings about backblast and minimum arming distance. Production tallies from Hassag's Leipzig lines listed monthly outputs climbing into the hundreds of thousands as 1944 turned to 1945. A bundle of maintenance cards from a Berlin arsenal on the 20th of April recorded field faults, fixes, and the rate of serviceable tubes by district. Paper matched practice. Method began before the shot. Crews in city defense learned to pick corners that forced tanks to turn because turret traverse slowed and side armor showed. They were told to wait until the muzzle brake or the first road wheel touched a mark on the street. Often a drain or a crack counted in paces, chosen earlier from a window. At 30 to 60 meters, the sight arc lined up with the suspension height. The shot went to the side plate or track run. If the tube worked and the gunner kept still, the warhead's jet did the rest. Constraints framed safe use. The backblast cone behind the tube made cellars dangerous unless aired and cleared. The minimum arming distance made shots inside a whisper range a poor choice. Wet propellant could fail, and wind-down alleys could push the head offline. Terrain mattered. Narrow streets were good. Open squares were bad unless flanking angles existed. The weapon did one thing at one range, and its users learned to build their fight around that. A short logistics vignette shows the life of a tube. A rail manifest stamped at the Anhalter Bahnhof on the 12th of April, 1945, listed crates by count and platform. A truck carried them to a district depot near the Landwehr Canal. A clerk logged serial blocks on a unit AAR page for Volkssturm Berlin Mitte on the 19th of April. Half the crates moved on handcarts to stairwells along Unter den Linden. A sergeant tore out the range table and taped it to a wall above a chalk sketch of a street corner. Myth versus evidence again appeared in the paperwork. The myth said wind or rain made the weapon useless. Evidence on range tables included corrections for head drift at 100 meters, with notes to halve the arc in rain and to wait for lulls along streets. Maintenance cards recorded that dry storage in courtyards raised serviceable rates by more than 1 in 10 compared to damp basements. The weapon was blunt, but its users were methodical. Units and places explain how the method spread. In Warsaw, assault groups from SS Sturmbrigade Durlawanger and police regiments paired tubes with flamethrowers along Ogrodowa and Towarowa, using corners by the Wola tram line. In Berlin, Panzer Division Müncheberg mixed tube teams with machine gunners at Moltkebrücke and the Spree Quays, while Volkssturm battalions in Friedrichshain set firing points on Frankfurter Allee. Soviet formations, 3rd Shock Army near the Reichstag, 9th Guards Tank Corps pushing from Alexanderplatz, and 79th Rifle Corps along the Landwehr Canal, met the pattern with smoke and suppressive fire, yet still lost vehicles when range collapsed. Aerial recon photos taken on the 20th of April over the Tiergarten showed side-scarred hulls at street bends and short black blast marks on cobbles. Those marks were witness objects as clear as any card. Range tables from captured caches matched those corner distances to the sight arcs. Production tallies from Leipzig explained why the pattern appeared on so many blocks at once. Output had flooded city depots weeks before the last fights. Numbers held the center of the method, 30 meters for the earliest model, 60 meters for the mid-war model, 100 meters for the late model, more than 200 millimeters of penetration on a square hit. Roughly 70% reliability in field dirt with proper storage. These were not slogans. They were working figures printed, signed, and carried from plant to stairwell. The tease for the field tests is simple. Put the tube in a doorway on Aleje Jerozolimsky in August 1944 and watch an assault gun halt at drain distance. Place it on Unter den Linden on the 19th of April, 1945, and see a tank stop with a side plate torn. Try it in rain off the Spree on the 23rd of April and see drift-cut hits until wind settles. The field made a lab, and 3 corners would show why the old rule died. The weapon met its proof in streets, not in manuals. Corners, tram lines, and river walls became the lab. The dates were tight and cruel. Early August in Warsaw, late August in the Old Town, and mid to late April in Berlin. Each place added one twist of terrain, one unit name, one number that fixed cause and effect, and one witness object that did not lie. Case 1 was Wola, Warsaw, the 6th of August, 1944. SS Sturmbrigade Durlawanger advanced east along Chodna toward the Vistula with an assault gun leading and police infantry in trace. Wet cobbles and a bend at Żelazna cut the line of sight to less than 60 meters. A single tube fired from a doorway punched the side plate, stopping the vehicle within the length of one tram car. A Home Army Unit AAR page logged the shot's distance and the turret's final heading. The measurable effect was delay. The column stalled for more than 20 minutes while rifles raked windows, and a second tube was reloaded in the next stairwell. Case 2 was the Old Town, Warsaw, the 26th of August, 1944. Polish Home Army fighters had captured crates of tubes from a rail spur near the Vistula and learned the arcs in cellars. Narrow lanes around Puna and Świętojańska forced German assault guns to turn with side armor exposed for several seconds. One warhead struck a track at less than 50 meters and sheared the run. An aerial recon photo from that afternoon marked the hull with a dark bloom by the right road wheel. The measurable effect was a break in the push. 2 blocks held until night, and a ferry manifest for wounded at the river steps listed the delay's human cost. Case 3 was Berlin, the 19th of April, 1945, between the Spree and Unter den Linden. Panzer Division Müncheberg attached tube teams to machine gun posts along intersecting streets near Moltkebrücke. Soviet 3rd Shock Army tanks bounded between corners with smoke at the turrets, but each bound fell inside 100 meters of a firing point. A warhead hit a hull side at the far edge of the sight arc and burned through. A Soviet range table recovered later noted the angle and estimated the hit at 90 meters based on scorch marks. The measurable effect was tempo. A regimental axis slowed to walking speed for more than 2 hours across a distance of less than 1 kilometer. The pattern around these cases was the same. Streets made ranges short, buildings made flanks show, rivers, rails, and tram wires fixed lines of movement that the tubes could read like printed cards. The surprise came not from trick shots, but from geometry that compressed battles into half a block. A logistics vignette sits under Case 2 and explains its reach. On the 23rd of August, 1944, a decoded signal summary listed railcar numbers bringing Faustpatronen through Radom into Warsaw sidings. On the 25th, a Home Army party seized a truck at a rail crossing by the Vistula embankment and moved 2 crates into the Old Town, counting 40 tubes by hand under a stair. On the 26th, a block leader taped the range table to a cellar wall, drew the 3 arcs in chalk, and drilled stance and backblast in 15 minutes. The tubes then met the bend at Piuna, and the dates on paper matched the hulls in the street. Terrain constraints shaped all 3 tests. In Wola, smoke from burning warehouses drifted along Chłodna and hid approach for seconds at a time. In the Old Town, rubble piles forced tanks to pivot at set cracks in the cobbles, marking aim points that fit the 60-meter arc. In Berlin, wind down Unter den Linden pushed shots offline at the 100-meter mark, and crews learned to wait for lulls that lasted countable heartbeats. Weather and street width were not backdrop, they were numbers on the sight plate. Myth met evidence in each place. The myth said the weapon often failed to arm at short range. Evidence from maintenance cards logged in a Berlin district depot on the 20th of April showed arming faults below 3 and 10 and concentrated in damp storage near the Landwehr Canal. The myth said operators could not aim under fire. Range tables with pencil ticks recovered from Wola stairwells showed pre-measured drains and door frames, turning panic into planned holds. Witness objects held steadier than memory. Units and map cues stacked across the arc of months. Durlawanger's assault groups and police regiments in Warsaw moved along Wolska and Chłodna, anchoring to the Vistula bridges. In the Old Town, Home Army battalions named for areas, Zośka, Parasol, set their firing points by church spires and the castle square. In Berlin, Panzer Division Müncheberg, Volkssturm Mitte, and machine gun detachments straddled the Spree and the Landwehr Canal near Moltkebrücke and the Anhalter Bahnhof. Rivers, rails, and tram lines stayed constant while orders changed hands. Time figures sharpened the effect. In Wola, a 20-minute stall after the first hit invited a second shot at near the same range. In the Old Town, a 2-block hold extended for more than 6 hours on the 26th of August on the strength of fewer than 2 crates of tubes. In Berlin, one artery lost more than 2 hours to a single corner where wind and smoke forced waits of tens of seconds between shots. These are not slogans. They are delays counted by advance guards and recorded in unit pages. Training details appear as the lightest marks in the record, and yet matter most. A Berlin stairwell chalkboard dated the 19th of April showed 30, 60, 100 next to a crude side view of a tank and a drawn window ledge. A Warsaw note in the Old Town recorded backblast 2 rooms, a rule that saved operators from burns and explained why some cellars stayed empty. A captured German leaflet glued inside a crate lid told men to aim at the first road wheel when side armor showed for less than 2 seconds. The tiny lessons wrote the green arcs into brick and air. The counter-voices from the receiving side also sit on paper. A Soviet battalion journal near the Spree on the 20th of April ordered smoke rounds at each street bend and infantry to dismount at the last safe corner, a change that cut losses within the next hour. Aerial recon over the Tiergarten that same day mapped 30-plus black scorch marks in a grid of less than 1 kilometer square, each tied to a corner or doorway. When the maps and journals agree, the case is closed. The tube worked as its builders intended, where streets forced range to collapse. The field tests ended where they began, on corners under a low sky, with river light and tram wires framing the shot. 3 dates, 3 units, 3 places, and 3 objects pulled one rule to ground. The disposable launcher, issued en masse and learned in minutes, had turned alleys into gun pits. Streets, not slogans, carried the verdict. Opponents adapted because they had to. In Warsaw in late August 1944, German assault groups began to lead with suppressive fire at each bend, putting machine guns on likely window arcs before vehicles crept forward. In Berlin in mid-April 1945, Soviet tank battalions added infantry screens hugging walls and tossed smoke at every intersection along Unter den Linden and across the Spree bridges. These counters slowed the tube teams, cut exposure, and kept turrets free to traverse, but they could not change street width or corner geometry. At alley ranges counted in tens of meters, even careful advances left seconds where side armor showed. Hard limits inside the weapon drew blood from its users. Backblast in closed rooms burned and concussed, and maintenance cards from Berlin Mitte logged several operators injured by firing in cellars without crossdraft on the 20th and 21st of April. Minimum arming distance punished panic shots at whisper range. A few operators fired too close and saw warheads fail to jet, a fact marked in a District AAR as blunt strikes with no penetration. Propellant damp in basements along the Landwehr Canal raised misfire rates by a few in 10, and bent sticks from rough handling pushed aim offline beyond 60 meters. The tube was simple, but it demanded space, dry powder, and patience measured in 1 or 2 breaths. Refinements tried to push those limits back. The mid-war pattern extended the practical reach from roughly 30 to roughly 60 meters, with a sturdier stick and clearer sight arcs, and late war models carried the arcs to near 100. A Heereswaffenamt circular in September 1944 added a bold warning about backblast in enclosed rooms and urged doorway firing with a 2-room rule, a training tweak that appears scribbled on crate lids from Warsaw and Berlin. Depot notes from November 1944 recorded propellant packing changes that cut damp failures by more than 1 in 10 when crates were stored above street level. The refinements were narrow and exact: sight, stick, warning, packet. Opponent refinements moved in parallel. In Berlin in April, Soviet crews wired mesh and bed frames to turrets and hull sides, an improvised standoff that sometimes disrupted the shaped charge jet at oblique angles. Tank riders walked the curb at the last safe corner and then sprinted to the next bend to clear windows with grenades. A battalion journal on the 20th of April ordered 2 guns per platoon to fire smoke at every intersection regardless of visible threat, a fuel-heavy change that reduced side hits in the next 2 hours of advance. The counters cost time and shells, but bought vehicles across alleys at a slow, grinding rate. Myth and evidence diverged here too. The myth said skirts or thin plates could solve the shaped charge. Evidence from range tables and wreck inspections showed that thin Schürzen, built for anti-tank rifles, did little against a focused jet when hit square at 60 meters. Aerial recon photos over the Tiergarten marked many scars at side plates behind those skirts. Conversely, the myth that bed frame standoff always saved crews fails under inspection. Maintenance cards from Soviet field depots logged penetrations when shots struck at 90 degrees or when wire spacing was too tight. The shaped charge kept its bite when geometry stayed clean. One quiet cost sat in production. Explosive fill and copper liners for the warhead drew on the same pools that fed artillery shells and wiring. Production tallies from HASAG showed output in late 1944 rising into hundreds of thousands per month, but the increase pulled men and material from other lines. Trains bore crates of tubes while some gun factories idled for parts. The numbers were large because the plan insisted, yet those numbers also thinned other stocks. Another cost lay in crews. Firing from doorways with a backblast cone forced men to clear rooms behind them, often in houses already crowded with the wounded. A logistics vignette from Berlin-Mitte on the 19th of April shows two men moving families into courtyards before they set a firing point at a window on Unter den Linden. In Warsaw, a training note from late August logged a fatal mistake when a shooter stood with a wall tight behind him. The margin for error was measured in a single step. The disposable tube was cheap in steel and dear in flesh when mishandled. Refinements in method went beyond hardware. In Berlin, Panzer Division Müncheberg began to pair tube teams with single riflemen, tasked only to warn for backblast and count the two-room rule allowed. In Warsaw, police regiments wrote a drill that fixed aim points to street furniture: first drain, first door frame, first tram pole, reducing decision time at the shot to under 2 seconds. A short directive on the 24th of April set a route change for resupply carts to use courtyards parallel to Unter den Linden, cutting exposure by a few minutes per run and keeping tubes fed to the front stairs. The method could be refined in steps the size of chalk marks. Opponents refined their routes as well. Soviet companies learned to avoid long straight runs where one firing point could see past 100 meters and to favor zigzag approaches along the Spree embankment where buildings offered crossfire but also cover. A regiment order on the 21st of April assigned 2 additional sappers per platoon to break holes through party walls, bypassing street corners where tubes waited. Travel time across a single block fell from more than 30 minutes to a little over 20. A small gain multiplied over dozens of intersections. The weapon's hard limits did not move. It remained a one-shot instrument with reliability around 7 in 10 in field dirt, with effectiveness that collapsed outside 100 meters and danger that filled the rooms behind the shooter. The refinements respected those facts instead of pretending to erase them. Geometry, not bravado, ruled. The counters that worked best changed angles in seconds, not headlines. By the end of April 1945, the ledger of counters and limits was written on the stones. Bed frames clanged on turrets. Smoke drifted down Unter den Linden. Doorways showed black scars from backblast. Production had done its part. Training had done its part. Adaptation had done its part. The tube still found side plates when corners held their trap, but every success now cost more minutes, more shells, and more care than in the first week. Immediate outcomes took shape block by block and can be read on dated pages. In Warsaw, through August and September 1944, German assault groups retook streets in Wola and then cracked the Old Town after weeks of grind, with tube fire clearing corners that guns could not reach. Bridges over the Vistula stayed under German control, keeping ferries and rail moving on clipped schedules marked in manifests. The dates tighten. The 4th of August to the 2nd of October saw blocks change hands under the push of short-range blasts and flamethrowers in tandem, with delays measured in tens of minutes at each turn. The old rule about armor dominance in cities had been erased, but the outcome favored the side that owned the rails and the depots. In Berlin, the dates are even sharper. From the 19th to the 23rd of April 1945, tube fire slowed Soviet regiments on axes that crossed the Spree and ran under the lime trees of Unter den Linden. Regimental journals record advances counted in hundreds of meters per day when smoke and infantry screens were thin, and in tens of meters per hour when corners held bed frames, machine guns, and tubes together. Aerial recon on the 20th of April mapped dozens of blast marks in a grid of less than 1 kilometer, a density that explains the tempo without rhetoric. By the 29th, the tempo collapse had narrowed to pockets, and the city's end was near. Operational effects ran beyond street counts. On both rivers, the Vistula in Warsaw and the Spree in Berlin, the disposable tube forced attackers to shift resources from speed to suppression. More smoke rounds were fired per block. More infantry walked curbs under walls. More sappers broke holes through party walls to dodge corners. Travel time for a tank company across a kilometer of city fell into hours instead of minutes, a ratio that consumed shells, fuel, and daylight. The tube did not win campaigns. It reshaped how urban ground was paid for. A logistics vignette shows what this meant for planners. A decoded signal summary from late August 1944 asked for steady rail of crates into Warsaw sidings despite partisan threats and bridge damage. The return signal acknowledged delivery and listed cars by number and hour. In Berlin in April, a production tally from Hasag showed consignments by the tens of thousands arriving in the city during the first half of the month, even as other lines starved. These papers tie the corner shots to the rail clocks. Without trains and trucks, corners stay quiet. The human cost sits in the margins of witness objects. Maintenance cards from Berlin counted burned operators who stood too close to walls. Soviet journals listed tank riders killed while crossing a single intersection under tube and machine gun fire. Ferry manifests on the Vistula recorded wounded moved at night when day crossings drew fire. Each paper line counts lives, and each line began at a corner, measured in paces and marked by drains and door frames. Myth and evidence must close together. The myth says the tube alone turned cities into fortresses that no force could cross. Evidence shows that combined arms, smoke, infantry screens, sappers, and systematic suppression recovered tempo within days, even under heavy tube fire. The myth says improvisation alone built post-war doctrine. Evidence in range tables, production tallies, and captured directives shows a chain from design to depot to doorway that taught later armies exact lessons. Measure your corners, fix your arcs, clear your backblast, and count your seconds. The long tail is technical and doctrinal. After 1945, armies studied the shaped charge jet and the human method that made it decisive at alley range. In the late 1940s, prototypes of reusable launchers and disposable tubes appeared in workshops from east to west, mixing lessons from the German one-shot warhead and the American rocket launcher into new forms. By the end of the decade, a pattern familiar to Berlin and Warsaw had a new name in manuals: the infantry anti-tank role in urban terrain, with drills that began at sight arcs and ended at backblast warnings. Training cadres taught recruits to read buildings like range cards. Urban fights in later decades carried the echo. Commanders measured blocks in seconds of exposure and meters of traverse, not in grand claims. Crews wired standoff cages or hung mesh when rumors of shaped charges spread. Operators learned to wait for drains, door frames, and the first road wheel at 60 meters. Manuals printed the small lessons that chalk once held on cellar walls. Open the second room. Breathe once before the shot, keep your feet planted, and do not shoot too close. The quiet craft of a one-shot tube turned into printed doctrine. Outcomes at the strategic scale remained shaped by bridges, factories, and coal more than by corners, yet corners wrote the day's bill. In Warsaw, the uprising ended in October after 2 months of losses and delays where the tube was a tool among many. In Berlin, the city fell in April and May after a week and a half of house-to-house grind where every 100 meters cost time, shells, and steel under tube arcs. The disposable launcher did not decide the flags on capitals. It decided how many windows broke before flags changed. The legacy sits also in the training rooms of peacetime. Paint lines on floor tiles now mark backblast cones. Glass cases hold the old flip sight with 3 arcs at 30, 60, and 100 meters. Range tables are laminated, not glued, but the numbers stay the same. Instructors point at doors and drains and make students step back 2 rooms before dry firing. The past's heavy cities still teach the same light motions. At last, the story returns to the original map pin. Aleje Jerozolimsky, the Vistula bridges, the tram wires in the morning haze. The old rule that tanks owned streets died there and then, in minutes and meters counted on a flip sight plate. The street is quiet now. Only drains and door frames keep their places. The reason still fits in a single throwaway tube.